They said the skies over Vietnam belonged to America. Jet for jet, missile for missile, no one believed a small country with barely a dozen MiG fighters could stand against the might of the U.S. Air Force. American pilots laughed, calling them targets, not enemies. But that laughter ended the day the radar screens lit up and the hunters became the hunted. From the dense clouds above Hanoi to the deadly Thud Ridge, tiny silver MiGs darted through formations of bombers like ghosts, striking fast and vanishing before anyone could react. Every American pilot soon learned to fear the sudden flash of a delta wing cutting through the sky, because it meant the impossible had just happened again. To understand how a handful of Vietnamese pilots defied the world's most powerful air force, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War.
When the Vietnam War escalated in the mid-1960s, the United States believed air superiority was a certainty. The American arsenal was unmatched. F-4 Phantoms, F-105 Thunderchiefs, and B-52 bombers roared across the skies with cutting-edge radar, long-range missiles, and pilots trained in advanced aerial combat schools. To Washington, victory from the air seemed inevitable, a matter of numbers, technology, and speed. But in the North, a very different kind of air force was taking shape. Born in the ashes of French colonialism and tempered by years of guerrilla warfare, the Vietnam People's Air Force, or VPAF, began almost from nothing. In 1959, they had no jet fighters, no radar network, and no experience in modern dogfighting. Yet by 1965, they stood ready to face the most advanced military in the world. The North Vietnamese pilots were young, many in their early 20s, and their training was split between China and the Soviet Union. They learned to fly MiG-17s, rugged subsonic jets that relied not on electronics or speed, but on agility and raw pilot skill. Later, the faster MiG-21s arrived, sleek and deadly, armed with infrared missiles that could kill in seconds if used correctly. But the numbers were staggering. For every MiG that took off, 10 American fighters could be waiting in the skies. The Americans dominated in quantity, but the North Vietnamese pilots learned to fight differently. They turned the country's geography into a weapon. The Red River Delta's jagged terrain and the heavy monsoon clouds offered perfect cover. Their ground-based radar network, built with Soviet help, guided pilots directly toward incoming formations. Once the enemy crossed into range, the MiGs would scramble in pairs, strike fast, and retreat into the protection of anti-aircraft zones before U.S. planes could follow. For the U.S. Air Force and Navy, this was a nightmare. They had come expecting open-sky duels where superior technology would decide the outcome. Instead, they found themselves ambushed again and again by a handful of enemy fighters that appeared and vanished like phantoms. The psychological effect was enormous. American pilots began to realize that their training had not prepared them for the close-range turning fights the MiGs preferred. In the tight, twisting battles over the jungle, radar missiles became useless, and only instinct and eyesight mattered. The MiG-17, slow but nimble, could outturn a Phantom in seconds, and the MiG-21, small and almost invisible on radar, could dive through clouds, launch a missile, and be gone before the Americans even locked on. Meanwhile, North Vietnam's air defense system evolved into one of the most sophisticated in the world. Soviet SAM batteries, the dreaded SA-2 guideline, ringed Hanoi and Haiphong like an iron shield. Each time American bombers entered the north, they faced a deadly gauntlet. Radar-guided missiles from the ground, anti-aircraft fire from below, and MiG fighters waiting above the clouds. Still, the odds were brutal. Many Vietnamese pilots never returned. Their airfields were bombed repeatedly, their fuel supplies limited, and their flight hours short. Yet despite overwhelming losses, they continued to fly, again and again. Each mission was a gamble. Each takeoff was a potential one-way trip. What kept them in the air wasn't technology or numbers or even orders. It was something far deeper, a sense of duty to defend their homeland, to prove that courage could stand against machines. They knew they were outnumbered 10-1, but they also knew something the Americans didn't. In the narrow skies over Hanoi, speed wasn't everything. It was willpower that turned the balance, and soon the world would witness how a few determined pilots, flying outdated jets, could rewrite the rules of modern air combat, one dogfight at a time. The Vietnamese pilots, who would soon shock the world, did not begin their journey in grand air bases or elite academies. Many came from humble villages and farmlands, where the roar of an engine was as alien as the concept of supersonic flight. When they were selected for pilot training, they were told simply, "You will defend the skies of the fatherland." What awaited them was an education, not only in flying, but in survival. Their journey began thousands of miles away in Soviet and Chinese training centers where the weather was harsh, the language foreign, and the standards unforgiving. The men who trained them were veterans of the Korean War and World War II, pilots who had fought the Americans and their allies before. These instructors taught them that dogfighting was not about machinery or range. It was about instinct, patience, and nerve. They drilled them relentlessly. Low-level flying, evasive maneuvers, and missile evasion. The young Vietnamese absorbed everything, knowing that every lesson could one day mean the difference between life and death. When they returned to Vietnam, they found a sky already filled with danger. American bombers pounded bridges, railroads, and airfields daily. Each mission was an act of defiance. Ground crews worked day and night under constant threat of air raids, camouflaging aircraft with tree branches and building underground shelters for mechanics. Some airfields were hidden deep in valleys, with runways barely long enough for takeoff. The pilots would launch, fight, and land within minutes, before the inevitable wave of American retaliation arrived. The first unit of North Vietnamese jet fighters, the 921st Regiment, known as the Red Star Squadron, took shape in 1964. They flew the MiG-17, a short-range dogfighter with no radar and primitive gun sights. Against radar-equipped Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, it was obsolete. But under the hands of pilots like Pham Ngoc Loan, Nguyen Van Bay, and Tran Hanh, the MiG became something far more dangerous, an extension of human instinct. They quickly learned to use their weaknesses as strengths. The MiG-17 was slower, but its turning radius was far tighter than any American jet. In combat, they would fly low, hugging the terrain to avoid radar detection, then climb sharply to ambush enemy formations. American pilots often never saw the attack coming until tracers flashed past their canopies. When the MiG-21 arrived in 1966, the balance shifted again. Sleek, fast, and armed with deadly K-13 missiles, gave Vietnamese pilots the ability to strike hard and disappear. The combination of MiG-17s and MiG-21s created a deadly trap. MiG-17s would bait the Americans into turning dogfights at low altitude, while the MiG-21s dove from above, unleashing their missiles and retreating into the clouds. It was a symphony of coordination, simple, yet devastatingly effective. The Americans called it hit and run, but to the Vietnamese, it was strike and survive. Every kill mattered. Every surviving aircraft was a symbol that their skies were not conquered. The pilots developed signals and silent codes with ground radar operators who guided them through the dense radar coverage of the north. Turn right 5 degrees, enemy approaching, altitude 4,000 meters. The radar voices became lifelines in the chaos of combat. Many of these pilots knew their names would never be written in history books. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they had no choice. Hanoi, Haiphong, and their families below were targets every day. For them, climbing into a MiG wasn't heroism, it was duty. Still, they grew into legends. Nguyen Van Cock, who would later become Vietnam's top-scoring ace, began as a quiet cadet who barely spoke during training. But in the skies over the Red River Delta, he developed a cold precision that terrified American pilots. He understood his aircraft's limits better than anyone: when to turn, when to climb, and when to fire. His kills came not from luck, but from discipline and instinct. American forces were slow to adapt. They believed in long-range missile combat and radar locks, while the Vietnamese fought close and fast. Many U.S. missiles failed in the thick humidity of the tropics, and when fights closed to within visual range, the Phantoms, big, heavy, and designed for speed, struggled to keep up.
The Americans responded with new programs like Top Gun, retraining their pilots to handle the unpredictable style of air combat that the Vietnamese had perfected. But by then, the VPAF had already carved its reputation. In just a few years, they had turned outdated jets into weapons of psychological warfare. Every sortie was dangerous beyond comprehension. Fuel was scarce, spare parts were improvised, and maintenance crews often worked under torchlight during blackouts. When bombs fell nearby, they simply covered their ears and continued working. For them, every repaired MiG meant another chance to strike back. Even the takeoff was an act of courage. The Americans monitored every known airfield, and the moment a MiG appeared on radar, F-4s were scrambled to intercept. The Vietnamese pilots knew this, yet they flew anyway. They took off through smoke and dust, sometimes dodging craters on the runway, trusting that their comrades on the ground would guide them to safety. In many cases, missions lasted only a few minutes. A pair of MiGs would rise into the sky, vector toward a formation of bombers, fire once or twice, and then retreat at full throttle into the cover of mountains and anti-aircraft zones. Success wasn't measured by how many planes they shot down, but by how long they kept the Americans from ruling the skies. Their courage came with a heavy cost. Some never returned. Their names were whispered quietly at the bases, written in chalk on walls that would soon be bombed again. But their legacy grew with every sortie. The Americans, once confident of total control, now flew with unease. Pilots described a feeling of constant tension, never knowing when a MiG would appear out of nowhere, forcing them into a fight they didn't want. By 1967, even U.S. intelligence admitted the truth. A few dozen Vietnamese pilots, flying outnumbered 10-1, had managed to challenge the world's strongest air force, and sometimes to defeat it. What the Americans saw as chaos was in reality precision born of desperation. And what they mistook for luck was the product of endless training, sacrifice, and will. These men had learned that victory didn't come from power. It came from persistence. And soon, in the battles that followed, the skies over Vietnam would turn into the most dangerous arena on Earth, where courage and instinct clashed with technology and arrogance, and where a handful of MiGs would carve their names into history through fire and smoke.
The morning of May 10, 1972, began like countless others in North Vietnam, humid, gray, and heavy with the distant rumble of thunder. But that thunder wasn't from storms. It came from hundreds of American jets screaming across the sky, part of Operation Linebacker, a massive air assault meant to cripple Hanoi's defenses once and for all. To the U.S. Air Force, it was supposed to be a demonstration of total dominance, a clean sweep that would silence the North's remaining resistance. But to the Vietnamese pilots waiting in concrete shelters beneath the earth, it was something else entirely. It was their moment. In the darkness of the underground hangars, young pilots of the 921st and 927th Regiments sat silently beside their MiG-17s and MiG-21s. Some were veterans with dozens of missions behind them. Others were barely 20 years old. They had been awake since before dawn, waiting for the signal. Sweat rolled down their faces as they checked their flight suits and helmets. Mechanics whispered final instructions, and the air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and damp concrete. Then, at exactly 8:45 a.m., the alarm sirens wailed. Target approaching Hanoi, multiple groups, altitude 5,000 meters. The order came over the speakers. MiG pilots, scramble! Engines roared to life. One by one, the MiGs burst from their camouflage shelters, their tires screeching across narrow runways, still wet from a night rain. In seconds, they were airborne, climbing through low clouds toward the sound of distant explosions.
Above them, the sky was already alive with chaos. Contrails twisting like white scars, flak bursts dotting the horizon, missiles leaving streaks of fire in every direction. American F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunderchiefs flew in massive formations, their radar screens lighting up with signals of approaching enemies. "Bandits inbound!" one U.S. pilot shouted over the radio. But before he could react, a silver MiG-21 cut across his nose like lightning, fired a single K-13 missile, and vanished into the clouds. The Phantom never stood a chance. Down below, anti-aircraft guns thundered from every direction, filling the air with shrapnel. It was impossible to tell friend from foe. The entire sky had become a moving battlefield, a living storm of fire, smoke, and metal. For Nguyen Van Cock, Vietnam's leading ace, this was not chaos. It was home. His radar operator's voice crackled in his ear. Enemy bombers, bearing 270, altitude 4,000. He throttled forward, breaking through the clouds just as the silhouettes of American F-4s came into view, dark shapes glinting against the morning sun. He waited, calm, calculating. Then he rolled his MiG onto its back and dove straight through the formation. The Americans scattered in panic. Missiles fired in every direction, but none hit. Cock pulled up sharply, locked onto one Phantom climbing away, and fired. The missile streaked ahead, trailing smoke, then exploded in a burst of orange flame. "Splash one," he whispered, his voice steady. Meanwhile, south of Hanoi, Nguyen Van Bai, flying one of the older MiG-17s, was already deep in the fight. He was being chased by two F-4s, both faster and better armed. But Bai knew his jet could turn tighter. He cut throttle, forcing the Phantoms to overshoot, then pulled into a hard climbing turn. The sky spun around him. When the first F-4 appeared in his sights, he squeezed the trigger. The 23mm cannons erupted, their shells tearing through the enemy's fuselage. The Phantom exploded in a blinding flash, debris raining down over the jungle. Bai's own aircraft shuddered from the shockwave, but he didn't stop. Another F-4 was closing fast, firing missiles. He twisted low, dodging the first, then the second. Both streaked past him harmlessly. He dropped altitude, skimming the treetops, using the terrain as cover. Behind him, the American pilot lost visual contact and pulled away. Bai was gone, swallowed by the jungle haze. Above Hanoi, the battle reached a fever pitch. Dozens of American jets clashed with barely a dozen MiGs, yet the Vietnamese pilots fought like they were everywhere at once. They attacked in pairs, diving from clouds, launching missiles, and then retreating into anti-aircraft zones where American pursuers dare not follow. To the Americans, it felt like fighting ghosts. Every radar lock ended with nothing but empty sky. "Where the hell did they go?" one U.S. pilot shouted. But the MiGs always returned. Pham Ngoc Loan, one of the first Vietnamese pilots to score an air-to-air kill, flew straight through a formation of bombers that morning. His MiG shook violently from the turbulence, alarms blaring in his cockpit. Yet he kept his focus on one target, a Thunderchief trying to pull away. He fired his guns until the barrels glowed red and the bomber erupted in smoke. Before he could celebrate, his own aircraft was hit by shrapnel. Warning lights flashed, fuel leaking, but he didn't eject. He turned his crippled MiG toward the mountains, fighting to keep it steady. He made it back, barely, the aircraft skidding across the dirt runway with its landing gear half deployed. When the canopy opened, the ground crew saw his face, covered in soot, but smiling. The Americans couldn't understand it. Every statistical model, every simulation said the same thing. The North Vietnamese Air Force should have been wiped out months ago. Yet every time they launched a raid, the MiGs were there, waiting, fighting, surviving. By noon, the sky was littered with burning wrecks and drifting parachutes. The U.S. forces claimed several kills, but they had lost more than they expected. And the Vietnamese, outnumbered 10-1, still held the sky. For the pilots on both sides, it was personal now. The Americans fought for survival, the Vietnamese for pride. Each side saw the other through the same gun sight, just men trapped in machines, spinning through the same deadly sky. At one point, two jets collided head-on at supersonic speed, vanishing in a flash that left nothing but falling fragments. There were no winners in that collision, only silence. When the final wave of American bombers retreated, Hanoi still stood. Smoke rose from the suburbs, but the capital had not fallen. The surviving pilots landed one by one, their aircraft riddled with bullet holes, their fuel tanks nearly empty. The ground crews cheered, though many wept. Some of their comrades would never return. In the debriefing rooms that afternoon, commanders spread out maps littered with enemy tracks, missile launches, and confirmed kills. For every Vietnamese loss, 2 American aircraft had gone down. Against impossible odds, the VPAF had done it again. That night, as the sun set over the pock-marked runways, the pilots sat together in silence. The air smelled of burnt metal and smoke. They didn't speak of heroism or victory, only of those who hadn't come back. Yet deep inside, they knew what had happened that day was more than survival. It was proof that courage, strategy, and unity could turn weakness into power. Across the Pacific, American commanders reviewed the same battle reports in disbelief. How could a handful of MiGs, some built a decade earlier, tear through the world's most advanced air fleet? The answer was clear, but hard to accept. The Vietnamese pilots had mastered the art of asymmetric air warfare. They didn't fight by American rules, they fought by their own. May 10th became one of the most studied days in aviation history, a day when courage outmatched technology. From that point on, every American pilot flying over the North carried an unspoken fear. Somewhere in those clouds, a MiG was waiting. And every Vietnamese pilot who took off after that day carried something even heavier: the memory of comrades who never returned, and the knowledge that every flight was a promise kept to their homeland. The battle for the skies over Vietnam was far from over, but from that day forward, no one, not even the Americans, would ever again laugh at the idea of Vietnamese pilots standing alone against the storm.
When the smoke finally cleared over Hanoi, the wreckage told a story numbers could never capture. Charred fragments of MiGs and Phantoms lay scattered across rice fields, mountains, and villages, twisted metal reminders of the fury that had filled the skies. For the United States, May 10, 1972, and the many dogfights before and after it were more than tactical failures. They were psychological shocks. The most advanced Air Force on Earth had discovered that courage, terrain, and discipline could blunt even the sharpest edge of technology. In the months that followed, U.S. commanders pored over radar logs, gun camera footage, and debriefing reports. The conclusion was sobering. American training was flawed. Their pilots had been prepared for long-range missile duels, not for the close, turning battles where the MiG's agility and the Vietnamese pilots' instincts ruled supreme. This realization led to one of the most significant changes in modern air warfare: the birth of the U.S. Navy's Top Gun program and new Air Force training schools designed to replicate the very tactics that had humiliated them. Ironically, the small Air Force that America once mocked had reshaped the way its future wars would be fought. For the Vietnamese pilots, the aftermath was far more personal. Victory brought no celebration, only survival. Each success came at a cost: a friend missing, an aircraft that never returned. Airfields were still bombed daily, runways had to be rebuilt every night by hand. Mechanics worked under candlelight patching bullet holes with scrap metal scavenged from wrecked planes, yet morale remained unbroken. Every surviving pilot carried within him the same conviction: they had proven that Vietnam's skies belonged to no one but themselves. The battles of 1965 to 1972 transformed the Vietnamese People's Air Force into a fledgling unit, into a symbol of national pride. Their aces like Nguyen Van Cock, Nguyen Van Bai, Pham Thanh Nan, and Le Hay became legends not because of the number of planes they downed, but because of the odds they defied. Most flew outdated MiGs built in the 1950s, yet they outmaneuvered opponents flying jets that cost millions more. Against overwhelming power, they carved out small but undeniable victories that resonated far beyond the battlefield. Internationally, their success stunned military analysts. Western media began to acknowledge the skill and bravery of the North Vietnamese pilots. The myth of technological invincibility was shattered. American strategists started to study not just their own failures, but the discipline and coordination of their opponents. The seamless integration of radar control, ground-based missile defenses, and fast hit-and-run air tactics. But in Vietnam, glory was bittersweet. The cost of defending the skies was written in loss. Families received news of sons who had vanished in dogfights, their remains never found. Many pilots who survived carried lifelong scars, burns, injuries, and the heavy silence of memory. Yet they returned to their cockpits whenever called, because the war was not over. When peace finally came in 1975, only a handful of those early pilots were still flying. Their hair had grayed, their uniforms faded, but the pride in their eyes remained. They had faced a force 10 times their size and survived. They had fought not for medals, but for existence, and they had won that right. In the years that followed, their legacy lived on in training schools and museums, but also in the skies themselves. Vietnamese pilots continued to fly MiGs for decades, their wings carrying the echoes of those who came before. And for generations of aviators around the world, the lessons of Vietnam became gospel. Numbers alone don't decide a battle. Spirit does. The Americans left behind new doctrines, new technologies, and the memory of an enemy that refused to break. The Vietnamese left behind something even greater, proof that courage, when guided by purpose, can turn even the smallest force into a legend. The sky over Vietnam, once a graveyard of fire and smoke, became a monument to those who fought there. Every wreck still buried in its soil whispers the same truth, that in war, bravery is measured not by how many survive, but by how many refuse to stop fighting.
Decades later, the roar of jet engines has faded, but the echoes of those battles still linger above the jungles and mountains of Vietnam. The MiGs, that once danced with death, now sit silent in museums, their paint chipped, their stories preserved in photographs and fragments of steel. Across the ocean, American pilots who once feared those elusive fighters now teach their students the lessons born from that sky, lessons written in fire, courage, and loss. The Vietnam War proved that technology alone could not guarantee victory. It was a war that humbled the mighty and immortalized the few who dared to stand against them. For every dogfight, every missile streaking through the clouds, there was a human heartbeat, one that refused to surrender. And so, as the world looks back at that era, the question remains, how did a small nation with limited resources withstand the most powerful air force on Earth? The answer lies not in the machines, but in the men behind them. Pilots who believed that freedom was worth any risk and that even the sky could be reclaimed by those brave enough to fight for it. Because in the end, war does not remember numbers or ranks, only the spirit of those who refuse to fall.